Well, now that we have a sense of the three things that control exposure, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, let's take a look at how they interact using something called the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle allows us to take a look at this interaction or the relationship between these three things. And so we remember that shutter speed controls the amount of time that light is allowed to enter the camera, and as such controls how motion is stopped or blurred in our photographs. We also remember that aperture controls the volume of light that enters our camera, and not only does it control the volume of light by controlling the size of a hole or aperture in the lens, but it also controls depth of field or depth of focus, what is in focus from near to far in our photographs. And lastly, we have ISO, the sensitivity of the camera's sensor. With film cameras, we have to change the film to change the ISO, but with digital cameras, we change a switch or a dial on the camera that allows us to change the sensitivity of the sensor. All we're really doing is turning up the amplification of that sensor, and as we turn the amplification up, we generate greater noise with higher ISOs, and we have less noise with lower ISOs. Each one of these three things, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, are interdependent. They depend on one another. So a change in shutter speed requires a change in aperture, simply because the total volume of light entering the camera should stay the same for any given scene. Similarly, if we change the ISO, we'll probably need to change the aperture or the shutter speed. So changing one of these elements necessarily means changing another. And that is because there is this equivalency of exposures. If we take a look at shutter speeds and remind ourselves once again that these are fractions with numerators over the denominators of the numbers, and we pair them up with apertures that are one whole stop or one stop jump from one to the next, we can remind ourselves that each one of these is an equivalent exposure. A 30th of a second at f22 is the same as a 60th at f16, and a 125th of a second is the same at f8 is the same as 250th of a second at f5.6. The total volume of light entering the camera with a 500th of a second at f4 is the same as the total volume of light entering the camera at 1/1000th of a second at f2.8. That same equivalence of exposure holds true both for aperture and shutter speed, and also for ISO in either of the other two controls. So when we look at this combination of ISOs and shutter speeds, ISO 100 at a 30th of a second is equivalent to ISO 800 at 250th of a second in terms of the overall volume of light that's entering the camera, or the kind of exposure, the total volume of exposure that is happening. So these three things, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, are interdependent and depend on each other for the total volume of exposure happening in your photographs.